Good day, and welcome to the first of these food dialogues for 2020. My name is Jane Battersby. I'm an associate professor at the African Centre for Cities at UCT, and I've been asked to give an introductory session about the characteristics of the Cape Town food system as a way of grounding our ongoing conversations. My own work works on urban food systems with an entry point of thinking about food security, and so that will frame how I talk about the session today. I think at this point it's important to have a few definitions on the table. So when I talk about food security, I use the UN's definition. Food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. For the last 20 or so years, we've thought about food insecurity as being built on these four pillars of availability. Is there enough of the right kinds of foods? Accessibility. Are people able to use physical, economic, and social means to access food? Utilization. Are they able to safely consume and utilize the food that they access? And finally, how stable is that system? However, in the last month, the high-level panel of experts from the FAO have released a new document that identifies 6 dimensions, and they've added this issue of agency and sustainability into it. I think this is a really important addition. Agency allows us to interrogate these relationships of power within food security. Who has the power of choice? To what extent are people able to determine their food systems? And sustainability, how sustainable economically, environmentally, and socially are the food systems that feed into food security? I think these are really important additions and will frame how we talk about food security and food systems going forward. In terms of food systems, a food system, as defined again by the high-level panel of experts, gathers all the elements: environment, people, inputs, processes, infrastructures, institutions, etc., and activities that relate to the production, processing, distribution, preparation, and consumption of food, and the outputs of these activities, including socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. You'll note that both of these definitions fundamentally link the food system and its food security outcomes. And I'd argue that there's never been a more pressing need to consider these things together than today. We're living in an unprecedented crisis. COVID-19 has exposed massive vulnerabilities in our food systems. Within the first few weeks of lockdown, it became apparent that there was massive hunger emerging. Lockdown caused an immediate income crisis, closed down feeding schemes, shut down informal food retailers who were a vital source of food for low-income households. What we saw was not a problem of availability, but a crisis of economic, physical, and social means of accessing food. What's also been demonstrated is that the levels of food insecurity had been massively underestimated and demonstrated how very, very thin the veneer of food security in our city has been. In 2015, we did some work for the South African Cities Network in which we took BFAP's figures on what household income needed to be in order to guarantee a balanced daily plate of food, and compared that to incomes within the census 2011. And we found at that stage that more than 60% of households in Cape Town were already unable to afford an adequately nutritious diet. So when you add the covariate crisis of COVID-19 on top of that, we see this surge of food insecurity. Chronically food insecure households have been worse affected by COVID-19. Undernourished people have weaker immune systems and are therefore likely to be at greater risk of severe illness due to the virus. Additionally, we view high rates of obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and other diet-related diseases as outcomes of food insecurity and of food systems that have been designed to provide access to cheap, ultra-processed foods to the masses. Locally and globally, it's been evident that these diet-related non-communicable diseases are significant comorbidities with COVID-19, leading to greater hospitalizations and greater death rates. It's clear that the ongoing disregard of all but the most severe kinds of food insecurity and neglect of the food system has significant economic, social, and health consequences. The immediate crisis of COVID-19 has exposed negative outcomes of the existing food system, but it's also exposed a number of vulnerabilities and fragilities in our food systems themselves. These include questions about the viability of our ports, of access to inputs, of access to markets, health and safety of workers, price fluctuations. Globally, there have been many stories of COVID hotspots in food processing plants that have raised questions about sustainability and justice in our food systems. Question is, with this new awareness of global food systems issues and local food system issues, where do we go from here? How do we understand what the system looks like and why it's taken the form it is? And how do we start to plot new pathways for food system transformation? Is this our Hurricane Sandy moment? In New York in 2012, when Hurricane Sandy hit, it precipitated a set of conversations about the food system and led to greater food system localization and greater awareness of where food was coming from. So what we need to do, I think, is to understand what we're dealing with. The mainstream food system in South Africa has been characterized by being global in orientation, by being concentrated, opaque, and largely linear. Although I'm mainly going to talk about the post-apartheid food system and the current food system, we need to acknowledge that power in the food system has always been consolidated and has always been exclusionary. The very first physical segregation in South Africa was Jan van Riebeck's hedge in 1660, designed to protect and control European access to livestock. Colonial agriculture, the 1913 and 36 Land Acts, and a myriad of other actions concentrated power in the food system in the hands of the very few. In the post-apartheid era, we've seen our food system become increasingly global in orientation. This really started with the Marketing of Agricultural Products Act in 1996 and the 2001 Strategic Plan for Agriculture that paved the way for this liberalized and open agricultural system aimed at greater foreign trade. And as you can see from the graph provided, we're moving along a pathway towards increased agricultural exports and imports. The Western Cape in particular has focused on export-oriented agriculture. In 2010, the government noted that although the Western Cape accounted for just 21% of our agricultural production nationally, it accounted for 45% of the country's agricultural exports. The question is, what does this do for our food system? What does this do for food security? What does it do for food system agency and sustainability? One of the concerns that's come through has been the way in which this increased liberalized food system has precipitated nutrition transition. So just looking at this graph from Anne-Marie Tho et al.'s work, you can see the increased importation of highly processed foods into our diet. Another example is imports of whey, which is a byproduct of cheese production used in baked products and sweet snacks, increased from 15 million in 1993 to 80 million in 2007. So we have an increasingly global-oriented system, and that has some challenges. We also have an increasingly concentrated and consolidated food system, again, as a result of post-apartheid market deregulation. This has concentrated power into the hand of a very small number of actors, as you can see on the screen now. This concentration has reduced the agency of consumers. It's made it harder for new entrants to enter into the system and arguably increases the vulnerability of the system. Now, this concentration and consolidation, coupled with the increasingly global nature of the system, has led to some profound data gaps. So while we've got pretty good data on primary production, there's very limited tracking of food flows within the country. The fact that there's no single institution monitoring the food system and the system delivering food to the population means that we've got this dominant private sector control of data, which is neither uniformly recorded nor available. The control of substantial components of the food system by large-scale private actors is therefore a fundamental challenge to an evidence-based and democratic food system governance. This reality places a number of unknowns into the system and hinders proactive planning for food security. So what do we actually know about Cape Town's food system? Well, for the remainder of my time, I'll try to provide some very basic data about what we do know. Local production. Well, we should all know by now that we have a viable production system within the city of Cape Town. We have the Philippi Horticultural Area, Juistenburg, Vlakte, and other areas producing food. But what is actually being produced and how much is it? The latest figures suggest that there are over 45,000 hectares of agricultural land currently being farmed in the Cape metropolitan area. And as you can see from the graph provided, a lot of that is grains, predominantly wheat, fruit and nuts, which is predominantly grapes for wine. But there is this small proportion of vegetables, and there is this large proportion of pastures and grazing land. So what does this actually mean in terms of feeding the city? Well, in 2014, we took national consumption figures and disaggregated them down to the local and compared them with agricultural abstract figures on vegetable production. And we estimated that the production within the city bounds of carrots, cabbages, and onions accounted for about just over a quarter of the required vegetable tonnage to feed the city, and that potato crops accounted for just under 20% of the required potato tonnage. Does that mean we're actually eating the food from Cape Town? Again, these questions about flows of food make it very hard to estimate that. But it does seem that a substantial proportion of our diet could come from food produced locally. But we don't think this is the whole story, because what about other crops? When we looked at the Philippi horticultural area, we found that there were 50 different kinds of crops being grown, and very few of those were actually recorded in the agricultural abstract. So we think the figures are higher. But also, what tends to be collected is the data on commercial agriculture. And again, we know that there's a viable urban agriculture sector in the city, but there's no reliable data on what is being produced, either in terms of crops or in terms of volumes, or indeed where that food is going. So we think there's a real need to improve the data collection regarding production at the small scale and local scale. In terms of processing and distribution, there's a lot of food processing happening in the city. The graph shown here is when we mapped data that was provided by the city to us of the licensed food processors in the city. There were over 600 data points provided. Most of the major food companies that we have in South Africa were represented. So Tiger Brands, Nestle, etc., are all represented processing in the city. But there's also hundreds of small-scale operators being licensed too. We have this large-scale and small-scale systems operating at the same time. We know that this is contributing significantly to the Cape Town economy. We know there are important hubs of distribution within the city. For example, the Cape Town Fresh Produce Market still provides about 25% of the vegetables consumed in the city. And this is a really vital component of our food system, particularly for those traders selling in the informal sector. What we have seen over the last 25 years has been a complete transformation of the retail sector. We've seen a rapid expansion of supermarkets. So what we've done is mapped out where the supermarkets of the big four, Pick n Pay, ShopRite, Spar, and Woolworths, are locating. On the left, you can see where they were located in 1994, each green dot representing where a supermarket was, overlaid onto census income data. And you can see the rapid expansion into 2013. Most of these cases, this is in the form of a new shopping mall. And in South Africa, we have the 5th highest number of shopping centres in the world. And when the supermarkets enter in the form of a shopping mall, they generally come with the supermarket as an anchor tenant, and then with the associated fast food joints. So we're seeing a rapid transformation in the food retail sector, but also in the fast food catering sector emerging. Now, the question is whether this is good for the food system, whether this is providing, as some people will argue, better access to a more diverse, more affordable diet, or whether something else is happening. Because one of the things that we've also been tracking is what's happening in the alternative retail sectors. We mapped all of the informal food retailers in 2 neighbourhoods in the city, in 2 wards, and found that in just 2 wards in Philippi and Khayelitsha, there were almost 500 retailers operating. And in some ways, these traders are more attuned to the needs of the low-income consumer, being better physically located, selling in unit prices that are affordable, offering credit, etc. So we have these 2 parallel retail systems in operation, sometimes in a parasitic relationship, sometimes in a mutual kind of relationship. But these certainly are dynamics within the food system. Finally, there's these questions of waste. We don't have good data on what's happening with food waste in the city of Cape Town, but there are some pretty reliable data being generated at the national scale. And as you can see, we have waste all the way along the value chain, from production, post-harvest handling, storage, processing and packaging, distribution and consumption. And the different categories of food have the waste point in different places. There's been a lot of focus on how do we reduce food waste. And oftentimes this comes with focusing on technical solutions, thinking about post-harvest loss management, etc. But we've also got to recognize that there's an economic imperative to maintaining waste in some ways. You'd rather have too much in the system than too little. You don't want to have an empty supermarket shelf. And so in some ways, waste is seen as the cost of doing business. But we really need to address this. Firstly, from an environmental sustainability issue, in Cape Town, we're reaching a point where we have a crisis of landfill, and we're diverting an awful lot of agro-processing waste and supermarket waste and other food waste to these systems that could go elsewhere. There's been a focus on food waste philanthropy, thinking about food banking, redistribution of food from supermarkets, from processors. This is one solution, but there are some fundamental questions about whether this is appropriate, whether this is in fact greenwashing, whether we need to think about the issues of agency and justice within this, whether it is a way of doing corporate social responsibility and using the waste that's generated as part of the cost of doing business as a way of appearing responsive to need. The final point is that we need to move beyond linear food systems. We need to move beyond the supply chain with waste at each point and think about how the waste can be fed back into these systems. So moving towards the end, how do we start to embed these notions about resilience in our food systems? I think one of the important things is to maintain and support diversity. There is an alternative food system in operation. We have the mainstream system, but we have these alternatives. We have these small-scale, short supply chains, etc., that have been in operation and have been more greatly valued in COVID than they have been for some time. How do we do that? How do we maintain a diverse system? How do we acknowledge all forms of access that people are using and build on that? Because the resilience of the food system is to a great degree dependent on the resilience of the consumers and the actors upon that system. We need to recognize how food intersects with other systems. What's the relationship between the food system and the transport system, between food and energy, between food and water? How do we plan to include the food system in wider systems planning? And finally, we need to be able to work towards increasing agency and sustainability in the food system. So my concluding questions: to what extent do we have a food system that engages and enables food security? And how can the system be changed? Thanks so much.